My name is Bradley Cantrell. I'm chair and professor in landscape architecture. Welcome to the Summer Design Institute lecture series for our final lecture. I would like to begin with a recognition that the University of Virginia is located in the land of the Monacan people. We give our honor and respect. We also acknowledge the enslaved laborers that built the grounds and architecture and contribute to the spaces we occupy today. I'm extremely pleased to introduce tonight's lecturer, Associate Professor Brian Davis. Brian is an associate professor in landscape architecture here at the University of Virginia. He was a 2019 Rome Prize recipient in landscape architecture, and prior to joining UVA, an assistant professor at Cornell. He has practiced landscape architecture in Buenos Aires and New York City, and is a member of the Dredge Research Collaborative. His work focuses on ports, rivers, and cities, and especially their formal interrelations through time. This interest in landscape form is anchored by the realization that it can be both indicative of past processes and values, as well as future performance. In his work, landscape is understood as both a foundation for and an active part of democratic society. His work is also driven by the contemporary interest in design itself as a form of inquiry, a way to make desirable futures real, rather than as a mere problem solving or the application of principles or knowledge generated by other means. His current research and teaching centers on the use of dredge sediment to create new forms of public landscape in Baltimore and small port towns in the Great Lakes Basin, as well as writings about muddy landscapes in Argentina and Baltimore. He works in collaboration with the Port of Baltimore and the Engineering with Nature program of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as well as local partners and leading landscape architectural firms, including Scape and Mahan Reichel. Along with Sean Burkholder, an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, he organized Dredge Fest Great Lakes and is co-primary investigator of Healthy Port Futures, a $1.6 million research project that is featured in the 2019 exhibition Design with Nature Now at the University of Pennsylvania. Brian's talk tonight is titled More Massive and More Subtle. Please welcome tonight's guest, Brian Davis.
All right, thanks for that, Brad. That was nice. I'm really excited to have the chance to join you all. I'm also new to the department, essentially, although I was in your shoes. Well, I'm assuming most folks are SDI folks, and I was well, I wasn't an SDI. I was a graduate student here about 10 years ago. So today or tonight, well, I'm also very impressed that most of you made it to the Friday evening lecture after SDI. And so hopefully I'll share some interesting things and keep it semi-short, and we'll call it an evening. So tonight I want to present a few thoughts on one direction that I see the field of landscape architecture may go. I think that landscape architecture is recovering its inherent ability to work at large scales and to do so in complex and contested places in a context of climate change, violence, social justice, and economic uncertainty. I think the work that I'm describing and that I'm a part of is well underway, and it was started decades ago, in honesty, by some of the folks at the University of Virginia and many other departments or many other institutions. I think that to continue to develop this work, we need to adopt new tools, develop a new aesthetics, and renew our focus on simpler, more basic things. And for me, of course, my basic thing is mud. But it comes from a belief, a kind of fundamental belief, that landscape is not a luxury. So professionally, I come from conventional practice. I worked on this project here, Dallas Main Street Park, or Main Street Garden Park. When I was
sorry, Brian, do you want to, your screen is not shared anymore.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Of course. Long day here also. So this project, let's see. So working in conventional practice, doing urban design projects like this, I learned a tremendous amount, and I learned a lot about detailing, things that still really value. Detailing the interplay between big ideas and materials, the politics of getting a public project done, and as well as the economics. And this type of work fits squarely within a long tradition of urban design and modern landscape architecture. These places that I was a part of designing and learning from sort of elder designers in the context of an office, I think they're the type of place a lot of landscape architects aspire to create. They help to elevate quotidian existence and connect to a kind of cosmopolitan worldview that express the values of a culture in a particular place. The slide you're looking at right now is Riverside Park South in New York City. It's another wonderful, well, I think wonderful park that Thomas Balsley Associates designed. This sophisticated and ambitious project, there's many of them that you're becoming aware of right now. It was a case of landscape architecture atoning for the sins of modernist planning. That's one way to think about it, you know, with the severing of cities from their waterfronts, for instance, through the creation of highways during the time of Robert Moses. But at the same time, we were committing our own. These types of projects tended to be wed to the demands of developers, which have been the primary driving force in the sort of re-densification of cities, especially through gentrification. This project in particular was probably the most meaningful one I worked on at Thomas Balsley Associates. And this quote was by an anonymous photographer that posted the photo on Wikimedia, but I love it. It's like the highest compliment I've gotten thus far in my career. And it captures the notion that it's just an everyday park way out in Queens, and a very humble project where people just play softball and soccer. But there's some set of moves that happen here through the landscape architecture that introduce a bit of mystery or something unexpected, in this case, the unusual amount of dirt. That even as it, for the most part, just sort of fits in with our everyday life. The polymath Herbert Simon, in his book, The Sciences of the Artificial, he notes that the task of science is to explain without destroying wonder, and that aesthetics is a fundamental piece of this approach. He's talking about science. I think there's a corollary to that assertion in landscape making, and I hope you'll get a sense of that today in my work. So I see my landscape architecture, the way I'm practicing and working, is a three-way intersection between historical ecology, geomorphology, and human construction. It's still quite broad, but in practice, I tend to focus on issues of flood control, water quality, and public space. And this focus draws me to strange and but popular landscapes, like the one you're seeing on the screen, Hart Miller Island in the Chesapeake Bay outside of Baltimore. So I'm gonna kind of structure the rest of the talk with just a series of assertions, and then the second half of the talk, well, 3 assertions, it's not a whole big series. But I think they're useful for me right now, but I thought that they might be of interest or somehow relevant as you're beginning your work in education as a designer. In the second half of the talk, I will present a recent project. So my first point, there are no innocent landscapes. Landscape fundamentally enrolls nature and culture. So with landscape, the division between the two is essentially meaningless. Fundamentally, landscapes are political and ethical and aesthetic. And there's a great article that sort of explains this. It impacted me and helped articulate this perspective for me by Mary Louise Pratt. It's called The Arts of the Contact Zone, and shaped my thinking on this subject. So these places, again, Hart Miller Island, you can sort of see that disc floating in the water in the upper left part of the screen. I guess I can show you. I see my cursor. These places that I'm interested to work in are like a lot of modern landscapes in that their artificial nature and their contradictions are genuine. It's difficult to know how to operate here, however. There have been some people, like landscape architects Elisa Rosenberg and Gary Strang and Lawrence Halprin, that have pointed toward an engagement with infrastructure for decades. But landscape architectural models of practice and aesthetic conventions, especially at the scale of infrastructure and with these problems, typically rely heavily on development and capital projects. So putting in a bunch of money at the beginning, that's what I mean by capital projects, and then sort of maintaining it from there, usually without the help of a landscape architect. It's more of an architectural mode of practice. And I think that that way forward has serious limitations, at least for modern landscapes. When working in places like this, I always try to begin from a naive position, asking what it is that landscape architecture and design more broadly can learn from these places and what we can bring to them. So there are antecedents in the work that I'm interested in both science and art and engineering. The earth artists such as Heiser, Holt, and Walter Di Maria offer some clues. Some of these that I hold dear or believe are important are monumentality, horizontality, material displacements, sort of tracking the movement of materials, doing something with that tracking, and a strange aesthetics over meaning, interpretation, or solutions. The land artists are some of the most famous people that did this, but it's only a recent version of a practice that dates back a long time in American landscape making. So for thousands of years throughout the Americas, people have engaged in landscape practices that merge what we now would call infrastructure, forms that provide basic service, civic and social services, with art, forms that express and shape values. In my work, I always see modern American landscape architecture as just a small, recent contribution to this long and sophisticated tradition in the Americas. So all over the country and as far as I know, all over the world, strangely alluring landscapes are being built that have a certain kind of wildness. The potential of these places is not that they convey stories or solve problems, although they do that, but that they create novelty, new possibilities by making powerful forces vulnerable. Sometimes these forces are physical, like storms, storm surge. They sort of channeled storm surge and large waves to the creation of a wetland, but it can also be political or social or economic. Processes of urbanization, political exclusion, and the opaque grinding of bureaucratic machinery, environmental forces at massive scale, all of this ingenuity and striving and conflict are laid out in the raw in these types of landscapes. I always think of this quote by this person, Frank Hammonds, who was in charge of dredging and port operations for the Port of Baltimore for a number of decades. And he said that with sediment projects, you always have a constituency. You can meet them at the table or you can meet them in court later on. And I think that he was trying to get at a really insightful and optimistic point, that it was always better to have a conversation with people in an ongoing way early in the project. And that sediment projects are, in some ways, are like the most exaggerated form of design project, because they have this quality in a very extreme way. His insight seems particularly appropriate in intensely political and geological places like the coast, which are made through the collision and separation of many different value systems, power dynamics, injustices, streams, and productive processes. So occasionally, even during the period when the picturesque was completely dominant, artists have noted the power of these places. So in 1832, Richard Adams here, he would have been working in the heyday of, oil painting, picturesque, interesting scenery according to European ideals, developed in Tuscany largely, pleasing juxtapositions between vegetation and built form. But here, I love this painting because it's in the Museum of Latin American Art in Buenos Aires, and he recognizes that the low, muddy Ribera, or the sort of mudflat between Buenos Aires and its estuary, is the real subject of his art, and it's where the life of the city happens. It's the place where work and social and ecological interaction happen over time. Okay. So I want to now move to the main project, the project that Brad referred to and that I've been working on primarily for a number of years. And then we've been together with a few other lessons. So the name of the project is Port Futures, or Healthy Port Futures technically. It was a 1.6 million three-year project, what I would call design research, so exploration of what's possible from a set of givens, working with science and local communities to improve human and ecosystem health of the Great Lakes. And the place I want to describe is sort of, it's in the Drumlin Field, what's known as the Drumlin Field of upstate New York, so the southeast shore of Lake Ontario, basically just south of that dark blue area where the contour lines disappear. The area where contour lines are on this digital elevation model, that's the lake itself, that's the bathymetry. And so the area that I want to focus in on is in the Drumlin Field. So the Great Lakes are pretty interesting. I mean, I think they're really interesting. Much of the Great Lakes now, as the land around them has turned from land and landscape into property, the shorelines have become hardened because they were something that was owned and needed to be defended or protected or removed from the dynamic processes of the lake coast. For a property in general, you need stability, and Dilip Dacunia wrote a pretty amazing, well, pretty interesting book about this recently called The Invention of Rivers that explores that in a lot of depth. So coastal landscapes are obviously the kind of antithesis of this, this idea of stability, which is why they're so rich, actually, for us and for all manner of plants and animals. And that's not only ecologically and economically, but also aesthetically. It's a paradox of our coastal and riverine landscapes that by valuing them intensely, but being unable to relate to them on their own terms, we end up changing them irrevocably, in this case, hardening the shoreline, which often causes them to lose something essential. Okay, so my second point, before I go a little deeper on the project, is that I've come to believe that landscapes are an epistemic borderland. We're always at the limits of our knowledge when working in landscape. We're always generating new knowledge. And this is a really important position to stake out, especially as we relate to science, but also to local communities as landscape practitioners. Landscape architecture is not a representational practice or a medium, or at least not exclusively so, but rather it's an experimental one, in my opinion. And it's because of this fact that novelty, new knowledge, new forms, new relations and objects and subjects are always being created. One set of definitions for both research and art that starts to bind the two is that they are a kind of crystallization and acceleration of lived experience. I think that's a really beautiful formulation that I've drawn from a couple of philosophers and researchers to help me understand what it is we're doing in the university. And I think that in the future, landscape architecture will be a primary means of research, that is, design in a time where the past is no longer the best predictor of the environment, will become more prominent as a means of generating knowledge. And because of this, it's important that landscape making work with good science and create new knowledge, but also not be bounded by the knowledge that exists. Okay, so this is just a little context shot, what you're looking at. If you see that eroded hillside, it looks like some huge version of some new development happening around here in Charlottesville, where they're putting in, you know, something and chewing away at a hill. But that's actually a drumlin that is being chewed away over centuries by the lake shore. And it's that drumlin. A drumlin is a huge alluvial deposit almost, but left by a glacier instead of a river. As those are chewed away, the sediment actually moves along the coastline and builds the beaches and wetlands. So it's a very natural, dramatic process. It's one that I'm working with on this project. I should make clear, I mentioned it at the beginning, but didn't when I reintroduced the project. So Port Futures is not just me, it's actually a lot of people, but two other really important people, really important to me, two other main people, Sean Burkholder and Teresa Tess-Ruswick at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay. So, and in all this stuff, we're always working together closely. So in this case, in Port Bay, the bluff wants to erode. And if you see the label on the map there that says eroding Drumlin Bluff, the one closest to the right, that's the one that, or the one furthest to the right, that's the one that you just saw in the photo. And then the area labeled Port Bay, so that's a big embayment. That was an area, you know, that was scoured out by the glacier, not deposited. And as the Drumlin Bluff erodes, sediment moves in the direction of the arrows and forms a barrier bar, which is kind of how we get like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, those types of barrier islands. It's a very similar process. These are super dynamic landscapes and amazing for that reason. And so here you're seeing, you know, just some tracing we did of historical maps to try to show, just demonstrate how it's dynamic. One of the things you can see here is that there in the center, it's getting really fat over time, the little barrier bars. You'll also notice there's a cut in the middle. That's now a dredged navigational channel so that people that live on the bay can get their boats out to the lake. And it's a landscape. It's kind of hardening or augmenting of a natural feature because these barrier bars are always breaching so that water can flow across the barrier bar from the bay and release into the lake. But if it's always moving around, it's hard to know where to get your boat out. So what we do as humans, or what we have done, is sort of freeze it in place, in this case with the jetty on the west side. And that jetty has caused significant shrinkage on the east bar. So the bar to the east, you can see, except for the westernmost point, it's shrinking significantly. And what's happening is that's now starting to breach on its own. It doesn't have enough sediment to maintain itself. So our project, our proposal, it's really simple. We helped them to understand. We talked with them to find out what was going on, what people wanted to go on, and what the plants and animals, especially, there's a special kind of turtle that breeds here that's really cool to try to create its habitat. It's special to Lake Ontario, this part of it. And so we simply proposed, instead of taking the dredge material from that block, that orange block that says #1, and putting it on the fat part of the islands, either historic placement 1 or 2, we proposed to build a kind of shrunken down version of a bluff almost, jutting out into the water. And it was intended to be out of the wave shadow of the jetty so that the waves would come through and move that material for us. So in a way, the project, it is about those big processes, but this is a short film of, not film, it's 20 seconds of the beach, just showing how it's dynamic at a almost microscopic scale. And we're just working with this process. We're just trying to put that to use, and in some ways just restore this, or accelerate this natural process. So we didn't invent that either. There's been an amazing set of projects recently in landscape architecture working with this concept or similar concepts. One that is very interesting is by George Tecumseh and the superpositions team, the river air restoration in Geneva. So you can see here they built a set of really, on the top, that's the constructed channel of a river. And on the bottom, that's after the construction, and once the channel has been able to sort of find its own form through this series of diamond cuts they made. A couple of lessons there that were important for us was building really simple initial shapes that actually work pretty closely with the formal logic of machinery, rather than trying to mimic natural forces, and then let the natural force itself make its own shape. So it's a kind of collaboration between an excavator and a river. And landscape architects are doing this, but also some engineers have been doing this. This is work by the Army Corps of Engineers. where they placed sediment upstream of an island that they wanted to restore and allowed the river to sort of nourish it carefully. Now that's interesting and important for me for two reasons. One, you don't have to pay to scraping a bulldozer back and forth over a large area to grade it just perfectly like you're doing an urban plaza is not a great idea. One, because it compacts the soil and kills all the little invertebrates that are trying to live in there and make it an actual ecology. And so it takes longer for it to come back, even though it looks more like an ecology initially. It also costs a lot of money. And so finding ways to collaboratively work with winds and currents and waves is an interesting way forward in some of the environments. But to do it, we have to know a lot about winds and currents. And so, and that often takes a lot of technology, and that's problematic for a lot of communities. It's just hard to have the expertise or the money to pay for the instrumentation to know what's happening with currents and waves in every single location. And so what we are doing is using simple drones, off-the-shelf drones, and working with a company, Michigan Aerospace, that they have an astrophysicist who's really good with lasers and is able to, by looking at understanding the way that the lasers are refracting through a medium, he's used to atmospheres, but in this case, we're having him look at water. He can give us a tremendous amount of information just from a combination of video and lasers that are simple lasers that are affixed to the drone. And we can characterize the currents and the wave climate pretty quickly in real time, not having to rely on the Army Corps of Engineers funding a $200,000 study to go out there and do it, for instance. And this is just a sort of methodology slide. It's pretty weird looking. Y'all probably making a lot of stuff like this in SDI. But the point here is that we're pulling in readily available, publicly available GIS data, but also other types of data that are remotely sensed, not only topographic and bathymetric, so underwater topography, but also wave data, so that we can build a model and try to understand how the waves are going to work in this area. So what you're looking at is Port Bay. That's the fat part of the island. And we're simulating a storm that would come in to try to understand the heights and periods of the waves as they attack this barrier bar, or advance on the barrier bar and start to move that sediment around. If we know those characteristics of the waves, we can get some velocities that would matter for moving the sediment and begin to predict reasonably what might happen to our little bump that we're trying to build out in the water. So this was one thing that we've been learning and learning from engineers and trying to assimilate into landscape practice. That's been some of my work over the last years as part of the Core Futures project. But one of the things you'll notice about this is it's really hard to account for form. You can build in types of resolution, but if you get down to the scale of what a human would perceive, or a spiny soft-shell turtle, or even a boat with a small recreational craft has to navigate, these types of models are limited in their ability. So that's a problem for landscape architects, because we really believe that form matters, or I believe that form. Actually, this maybe is a debate that y'all will be having over the next several years as you're studying, but it's possible, and I believe quite strongly that form is one of the main things that we do. There's an important ecologist, Shugart, that makes the case that form and process are mutually causal. And a good way to think about that is that form, form is not just geometry, but it's also pattern, or the distribution of geometry in space, and it's process, or the distribution of geometry in time. And a lot of my work in this way is related to Gottfried Semper, the architect, his basic insight that material in its form is mediated by the conventions by which it's made and the tools and the procedures applied, hence the interest in excavators, like how something actually happens. Okay. So a lot of my work is trying to find simple but sophisticated forms that produce a desirable effect in an environment. In my opinion, this is kind of what landscape is, and to varying degrees, what different design disciplines are about. So there's some amazing artists, in this case, Olafur Eliasson. This is one of his works that I forgot to label. But a lot of what we're trying to do is create something which will persist for a time and create an effect. But the object of the design for Eliasson here is not the ring itself, although that's alluring and attractive, but this sort of broader atmosphere or environment that he's creating. And I think that this interest in the secondary effects rather than the figure itself is a really important thing in landscape. So a way that we were trying to get at it in this particular project was what I would call a sediment drawing. And it's just a quick video. So we use a large geomorphology table to quickly, well, instead of trying to draw this with pencils or computers, those can get at it, but it's better to get closer to the medium, at least in my opinion, often. So we do these drawings with the water and sediment itself, trying to understand how the form would perform over time. And then we produce representations from this. So videos that you're seeing or DEMs that we can analyze. And by doing that fairly rapidly in these large scale tests, we could find the ones that are most likely at a small scale to work within the context that that larger computational model sort of set the boundaries that is suggesting work. And so what you're seeing here is what we hope will be the diagonal thing is a simulation of the port or of the barrier bar and our bump, and it's being hit by waves. And you can see that it's the sediment is moving to the top and right of the screen, in this case to the east, and it's filling in the gap up here in the upper right. It's now full of yellow sediment, which is simulating sand. Incidentally, like most representations, these also become really useful, not only for our understanding, but for communicating, whether it's to project team members or clients or community members. Okay. So a little bit of drawn analysis. And this too is not something that we were necessarily inventing. I mean, that's our particular take and useful for our project, but actually Brad Cantrell and Alex Robinson, Justine Holzman, and a few others in landscape architecture as well as architecture have made prior advances in this way of working in the field of landscape architecture in terms of working with dynamic media. And that's something we were drawing directly from. So this is the bump, or we didn't call it the bump, we called it the bell. And I'm trying to get Sean to agree to call it the bell. And it's so here it is, the channel is being excavated, and the excavator's just digging it right out of the channel. You can see how, to the left, how energetic the waves are, the sort of conditions they're working in. And that excavator just swivels around, places it behind, and a bulldozer moves that down the shore to the exact right location. We had worked with the contractor to figure out how far. There was a kind of dance between getting out of the wave shadow of the jetty, but not too far so that pushing it by bulldozer was uneconomical, because if they had to bring in a loader, that's another piece of equipment, more impact on the landscape and more cost, which working in this community, a working class community, additional cost was not an option. So the intent here was to work with the formal logic of bulldozers, waves, and sediment itself. You can see that angle, but by simply lifting the blade a couple degrees as he starts to push out into the water, the bulldozer naturally forms a ramp. And then that angle on the far side is just the friction angle of the sediment, which is decided primarily by the size of the sediment grains. And so we tried to create something that echoed the regional geomorphology, not so much in the geometry, although it kind of does that, but especially in terms of its performance. but do it at the scale of annual dredging in a small bay community that is a few hundred families. It's not a glacial process, obviously. And this is the project almost completed, or at least it's not really ever completed, but that was it being built. And in many ways, our proposal drew from a really interesting project in the Netherlands called the Sand Engine. This is at a massive scale, very much a capital project. Ours is much more of a maintenance practice. But this also works with forces and currents, using the waves to distribute the sand along a long reach of the beach rather than using bulldozers. And our approach is based in, like I said, it's a kind of annual practice based in regional geology. So that's our kind of adaptation. And you can see this was about 1,000 cubic yards, we're pretty sure. So interestingly for landscape, this was about 4 days later. A storm came through, and after it was completely blasted, and the feature that we built was completely gone. And as trained landscape architects, this was what we wanted. It was what happened in the models. It was also hard, and we were scared. We didn't know what happened. We had no control. And it also like hurts your ego a little bit because the figure is gone. But I think that was really interesting as a kind of landscape architectural approach, because if it worked, then that sediment wasn't gone. It was redistributed along the barrier bar, building it out, making it much wider, and doing it in a way that's not like a bulldozer where it's compacted, but where it will be a kind of well-graded and sorted mix across the barrier bar, possibly producing better habitat and being a little more interesting to look at. So, since this is research and not a firm, we have the ability to monitor it to see how it worked. And so we built in some pretty intense monitoring protocols, all of which were thrown up in the air by the pandemic. But we were doing it and planning to do it with remote sensing, drone-based, because of its accessibility and widespread applicability. The idea was that these small communities, they wouldn't have to pay for a $30,000 survey, for instance. They could just fly a drone over and start to get a sense of if their maintenance project had worked. We have to do a little, since this is the pilot, we have to do a little more, it has to be a little more buttoned up to show that it's working, or it can't get through the regulators' hurdles. Okay, so this is a case, or was a case for us, where generating knowledge is important, but it's not the point in and of itself. The point, of course, is a good landscape, and that had been sort of figured out with the community and stakeholders prior. However, we do have data, and in the context where we're working, where you have to get permits from the Army Corps of Engineers and the New York State Department of State and the Department of Environmental Conservation, that was really important, or it's a really important thing. And I think actually in landscape architecture in general, it's a more important thing than we often give credit for. It's also something that maybe architecture has sort of been leading in and doing a good job of pushing on in its own ways recently. So what you can see is that the bluff that was constructed completely eroded, and that the two sort of weakest parts of the bar accreted. And not only did we know that, you could see that by walking out there, but we know how much. We were able to quantify it in terms of volume. And almost all of the sand, it appears, is in the right place now, which was not expected. We didn't, probably something's going on that we don't fully understand yet, because it shouldn't work out that perfectly, the numbers. So this was the breach before the storm to the east of where we built the bell. And this is afterward. And this was actually in higher water than when it was constructed. So the water's gone down now. And it is, the beach has extended further. That's one of the things that happened. Well, anyways, that's nerdy and there. So in this after condition, this placement, the placement of the sediment, it was for free in some ways, on economic terms. and it was a higher quality than if you'd paid for it, done with a bulldozer. The community itself got an event, you know, this sort of dramatic creation and erosion or almost destruction of this figure. And it produced opportunities for doing better science, learning more about how sediment, sand, cobbles are moving in this environment, and creating habitat along the shore of Lake Ontario. But for us, Sean, Tess, and I, the project is first and foremost aesthetic. And that should sound weird, I would think, because it's kind of embarrassing. At least normally landscape architects don't show these types of projects. You know, we show much fancier landscapes when their aesthetics are being featured. At the very least, this type of aesthetic will never win awards. But I think that this is the experience, and by aesthetics, I mean simply kind of the philosophy of experience, or how we come to understand and deal with experience itself. It's not a particular style or anything necessarily. And this, in its kind of rawness, but its beauty, its accessibility, is, I think, the experience that's wanted here on the edge of a massive lake with a small community. Somehow producing a conventional waterfront park, you know, obviously like the type we had done in New York City, would be radically inappropriate. This simply produces, in the most basic way, the chance to inhabit the edge of a big unruly body of water, and with no tricks or expensive markers of design. And so in some ways, this is simply J.B. Jackson's definition of landscape. The landscape is a speeding up and slowing down of processes of nature, or designing with time. So almost done here. This is the Drumlin Field. I just wanted you to be able to understand it a little better. And the red arrow is pointing to Port Bay. But in the Drumlin Field of New York, there are 5 communities that are similar to Port Bay in their geomorphology, in their demographic and social characteristics, and their size. They're working class, Rust Belt communities. And I think that this approach to landscape architecture is an opportunity to maintain these communities and not harden the shoreline, which is there's a lot of pressure here right now to put like steel pilings and concrete walls and giant boulders on the edge, just as a way of preventing erosion in the kind of most brutal way possible. And what our project is doing, what this landscape architectural project is trying to do, is provide an alternative to that approach. But it will necessitate a more inventive and more basic approach to living on the coast. But by focusing on basic values and specific issues that are technical, historical, and ecological, and materials, I think we might show how design in general and how landscape practice can create a more common ground. And here there's no question or even desire for a fancy waterfront park, and they probably couldn't afford it even if it was desired. But even if they could, it wouldn't be right. It would somehow destroy the magic of this place. So with that, thank you all very much. And if there's questions, I'll take them. And if not, see you around.
There has to be questions. So there's you have to take some questions. I'll leave it open if people want to begin to put questions into the chat or raise their hands for Brian. I'd love to continue this discussion. Are there questions right away for Brian?
I have a question. Oh, sorry, somebody else going.
No, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, let me take that off.
Brian, thank you for the talk. That was really great. I'm just curious, and this is maybe kind of a question that Brad could also answer, something that's been bugging me ever since I learned about the sediment tables that you guys experiment with. You're scaling it down, but the aggregate, you're using sand to represent sand. And I'm just curious if the actual size of the aggregate that you're using in your experiments, if that matters, or if you've had time to kind of have that feedback loop where you're trying it out in real time and then learning from that. And yeah, just curious.
Do you want to answer that, Brad, or do you want me to? Well, I'll say
it's not my lecture, so I'll
yeah,
I'll give it
fair
to
enough.
you. I have answers also.
No, it's an astute observation, Sarai. And you're absolutely right. It doesn't actually really represent sand, at least not the sand out there. Also, one way we better approximate the material, the landscape that we're trying to understand, is we don't use sand. It's a plastic media that has a much lower specific gravity than rock does. So it moves around with a lot less energy. But even so, there's very much scaling issues in this little water table. So I actually don't call the use of that table a model. I don't think it's actually a representation in that it's not like a one-to-one characterization of aspects of the landscape. At best, I try to set it up, Sean and I, Tess, and you know, honestly, this approach was worked out through conversations with Brad and also geomorphologists. We try to get the effect that we can see in the table to be similar under similar conditions to the landscape that we care about. And then once we're able to reproduce that, we can intervene or do stuff in that new environment with some assurance that it's relevant to the other environment. But it absolutely has to be sort of calibrated, in our case, with computational modeling to sort of make sure that the boundaries and the approximate function is similar enough. And that's a common approach at least in coastal engineering, that you might try to get a really fine sediment, but you can't ever get it small enough in this setting. So I would call, just to ramble on for a minute, I would call that actually, and I think I did call it this, a sediment drawing. It's very much an experiment and not a model. It's not directly representing specific characteristics, but generally allowing me to access aspects of that landscape.
Thank you. I've been wondering that for ages.
I've got a question, Brian.
Oh,
the issue of sediment size in these models, you know, we've talked about this before, and I worked on the Guadalupe River project when the Corps was doing the physical model and the HEC2, I think it was, maybe, I don't know what it is now, but they always said that they had to combine both the physical and the computer models because, you know, they couldn't really figure out what they were doing without both. I mean, this is a riverine situation, not exactly like what you're working with, but they also use dye to sort of see just visually where the water would go along the river if they were trying to divert a certain volume. And they just sort of visualized, you know, like 3/4 of the water will move through this diversion in the design of the park. And is dye something that you ever use, or is it only the synthetic sediments that you use?
no, yeah, dye is awesome for sort of showing what the currents are doing, but in a pretty quick way. Pretty quickly, the water becomes, the dye dissipates or dilutes, and then you keep adding it, and at some point you have like a big tub of green water, as you probably saw. But you're absolutely right, Tim. So, Sarai, part of so working with Justine, conversations with Tim Baird, who worked on these types of projects at Hargraves and Associates 30 years ago, Tim. I had the benefit of drawing from that knowledge as we were literally trying to do this project. And a third really critical part for what we did here, at least, is all along there was an understanding that we were at the limits of our knowledge, both us, and often we're working with coastal engineers that run the same computational models, but a bit more sophisticated with them. Even so, monitoring, actually describing after the fact what happens and trying to calibrate future models based on that data is a critical piece of this work, hopefully done by engineers and not by not by the landscape architects. But all of the, I guess that's what I mean by this sort of epistemic borderland. Like there's, whether it's landscape architecture or whomever, there's always some part of the landscape that's actually beyond knowing or beyond control. And that's part of it's fundamental and it's part of its power, but it's tricky.
We have a question from Lyle. Lyle, do you want to ask the question or you want me to read it off the chat?
I can try. Do you have a sense of ecological effectiveness versus armoring or, it's moving, oh no, traditional beach nourishment? You mentioned compression, for example.
Well, so it would depend in what ecosystem you're talking about, probably. Like, and maybe to some degree specific species. There are probably areas where putting big boulders out there or putting a submerged breakwater further out is more appropriate. And there may be areas where spreading it around with bulldozers is better. I do know that here we're setting up next year to study to see if this produces better spiny softshell turtle habitat, which is the most interesting species happening out here. It's a pretty cool little and delicate thing. And if it's happy out here, then it'll be a good indicator. And folks from the Nature Conservancy and DEC are interested in the outcome of that and think it's reasonable that this is better ecologically. At least it minimizes disturbance, right? Like the disturbance footprint is smaller in terms of where the machinery is. I also know that just historically, the way that beach nourishment, especially pumping it into an area and then grading it with bulldozers, you know, the reason that typically takes place that way is commerce, you know, somewhere like Myrtle Beach or Wrightsville Beach or somewhere that I'm familiar with, but in a lot of places, like hotels and people that visit the beach, they want all the parts of the beach to be the same width and not be, you know, someone that's selling t-shirts doesn't want to be 700 feet from the ocean or what, you know, like historically those are the drivers actually. And it's actually been the recent, you know, last 20 or 30 years emphasis on ecological restoration in coastal environments that it's making some of these things a bit more possible, that and cost.
Great. We have kind of a two-part question, starting with Priyanka, and then Erica has kind of a follow-up to that. I don't know if Priyanka, do you want to ask the question or?
Sure, I can go ahead. Thanks, Brian, for the great presentation. I had two questions. That what is the bigger perspective towards the research, and will it inform the public in some manner about maybe the challenges of the ecosystem, or like what is a bigger outreach through the research?
So what is the bigger outreach or the bigger perspective? That's what you're asking? Like, I wonder what do you mean? Could you tell me what you mean by that a little bit more?
Like, what is the end goal of the research? Like, how can you, is it planning to create a collaborative initiation towards different sectors, or is it just like, yeah, what is the end goal of the research?
Well, so what Healthy Port Futures has been about, I can speak to that directly or talk generally about what I'm trying to do, but Healthy Port Futures is working with small and medium-sized towns in the Great Lakes. So these are generally Rust Belt towns, not Chicago or Toronto. And trying to look at the potential of what we were calling passive sediment management. So using waves, winds, and currents to do desirable things with the sediment. The idea is that it might, in some cases, be cheaper, and be and paying for these things is a real paying for sediment management is a huge tax on the public in the United States. Many hundreds of billions of dollars a year spent on that, and it's also a really important opportunity for ecological restoration. Sediment for a long time has been seen as a waste product, something to just get out of the way. It's a little hard to control. You can't model it. Like Sarah was pointing out, like it might have stuff in it that's bad. Just take it away and we'll put in the stuff we want from somewhere else. And we now realize that, you know, there is no way, and that we need to work with our materials and processes in situ as much as possible, even if the on-site is Lake Ontario or the southeast shore of Lake Ontario. And so that's what we are doing in Healthy Port Futures. We identified, there's actually 3 main projects that we're working on in 3 different lakes, all of which have different social and demographic, ecological conditions and sediment conditions. And so we are trying to do this sort of landscape-based approach and design-based approach. So it's not, you know, engineers are designers too, but in a fundamentally different way. Trying to present some alternatives to the Army Corps of Engineers idea, essentially. Man, I'm just rambling, but that's the best I could do with the question. I don't know, it's a big one. Is that getting at what your question is?
Yeah, you did answer my question. Thank you.
We basically want to create wetlands, cheap, big wetlands all over the Great Lakes. Because it used to be huge, beautiful wetlands everywhere. And it's been armored. And where it wasn't armored, it's been dredged. And then they dump the dredge material out in the middle of the lake and remove this incredible resource from the coastline, necessitating more armoring. And so we're trying to, like a lot of landscape architecture, ambitious landscape architecture, in the simplest way possible, trying to undo the work of the last 100 years, or the ill effects of the last 100 years, and rebuild a, you know, healthier world. On that note.
There's a follow-up from Erica. I don't know, Erica, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed the presentation. I was working in aquatic ecosystems before I started this program, so these kinds of projects are really exciting to me. But it just come up a lot in the past few weeks in SCI, talking about community-led or centered initiatives, and so I'm just curious what role that has here, or even if it does have a role, if those are conflicting or competing like hierarchies of input to work with scientists or the community. And it's kind of open-ended question. I just think it's really interesting to think of balancing those 2 inputs.
Yeah, well, you know, I have thoughts about that stuff too. And so on a lot of coastal, this particular project, honestly, at least in a kind of direct way, it's not a massive part. This is a piece of state land, the bar, the East and West Barrier Bar. This is controlled by the DEC. It's a very bureaucratic institution, and they are adamant that while recreation can occur and community input can be accounted for, this is about maintaining the healthy functioning of the coastline for the purposes of habitat, primarily. That being said, yeah, we were absolutely producing material and presenting it to the to community members. A lot of the feedback we got thus far was like, yeah, that looks fine if you don't, as long as your sediment's not going to refill in the channel, and as long as it helps fill in the breach so the big waves don't roll into the bay and destroy my dock, then that'd be great. We're hoping that it might induce some people to come down there to start to note, you know, by the erosion of this feature and the replenishment of the bar, and this happening every year, that people might start to become a bit more in tune with the processes that actually sustain their community. But it's not, they're not asking for that. DEC is not even asking for that. We are promoting that while we still speak to their goals and objectives, which are very pragmatic. I will say that in general in coastal landscapes though, because they are areas that tend to attract the wealthiest and the poorest for a variety of historic and economic reasons, working with communities becomes a real compelling part of the project most of the time. Just here, it was not that compelling.
Yeah, I thought that might be the answer, but I just had to ask.
Yeah, I mean, part of, in this case, part of the time, I think we're working with communities as landscape architects to try to right historical wrongs or improve material conditions or social conditions. But another really important part of working with communities is environmental education, which you're probably attuned to and probably have done some of. But I think that's a really important mantle too. For a long time, I think a lot of our communities have gotten used to really smart, or at least really well-funded engineers coming in and like solving the problem. They just like, oh, you got erosion, here's some rocks or a seawall or something, problem solved, don't worry about it, don't learn anything about the coast, don't, and so somehow, yeah, environmental, being able to read a landscape and understand what's going on and advocate for it and develop your own interests is a big thing over y'all's generation, in my opinion.
Great. I'm assuming you don't mind taking more questions, Brian?
No, I'm
You're here all
good.
night? Okay.
Yeah.
So Emma and Colleen and Gordon have questions. Emma, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks, Brian. That was a really, really wonderful lecture and super interesting work. It's really exciting that you're part of the UVA faculty. My question kind of relates more to this definition of a kind of landscape aesthetic in your work that you're starting to develop and kind of argue for. And I'm interested particularly in these kind of images that or references that you're kind of pulling in, these kind of Tuscan oil paintings, and then what I think are images of mound builders in the Amazon region. I'm just interested in the aesthetic that you're building up. How are those references kind of influencing your work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emma, and one that I'm honestly really excited to work on and work out over the coming years with, well, folks throughout the field and other fields, but especially there's so many great thinkers at UVA and students and everything. I'm working on it, but I will say that a thing that I've become kind of, so I was dedicated to that or working on that explicitly at when I was in Rome this past year, but I got somewhere, but then everything changed. The short answer that I'll give, and maybe we can continue the conversation later, is that if you look through a lot of, especially architectural treatises and theory generally, and also, and by extension, design theory, a lot of it is about symmetry. You'll see the word symmetry a lot. And there's a great book by a mathematician, Herman Weil, by the name Symmetry. And it goes back to Vitruvius. His book doesn't, but the references I'm talking about go back to Vitruvius, and you find them all the way through. And they're really interesting. And they're not just talking about, obviously, about like bilateral symmetry or relatively simple forms of geometric symmetry, but rather, I think you could understand symmetry as the creation of the figure itself. Any figure is somehow understandable in terms of symmetry. And I think, so I wrote a piece right before I left called The Asymmetry of Landscape, which was for me really important, sort of the culmination of looking at this muddy landscape in Buenos Aires. And looking at sort of the environmental and political processes and all the asymmetries inherent in those and how those are producing novelty even as they were extremely problematic. And I think it's possible that asymmetry is the thing in landscape, that somehow the design of landscape itself is not really about the figure and the creation of sort of proportional figures, although that is a part of what we do. But it's about asymmetry. It's about like these field conditions. If you look at, well, at least in these landscapes that I'm talking about. So if you look out at Lake Ontario, or you look up at the atmosphere, that's why we're attracted to the coast, you're not looking at a figure at all. And if there is a figure, there's a lighthouse or something, it only serves to throw into relief what's really sort of incredible out there. The same thing if looking around here at the landscape around here, when y'all go and look at the mountains when they're changing colors in a couple months, it's wave after wave, field after field, so much form and structure, but no figure really, at least as I have it figured out right now. And I think that there's something there that matters, especially because, at least according to most physicists, the only sort of asymmetrical thing in the universe that a lot of them think is real is time. That's the only thing that a lot of physicists feel can't be explained by symmetry. And that's obviously fundamental to landscape and to our perception of it. And so I don't really know where all that's going. I haven't written about any of it yet, except in like very chaotic Google Docs and like assemblies of images that are sometimes filtering into my presentations now. But it's been coming out through this work, talking with people, similar people, you know, Brad, Tim, Justine, Gina Worth, people like that over time. And I hope eventually to be able to say something smarter and more definite on it.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Colleen has a question. I think in some ways it ties nicely into that question also. And then Gordon has a follow-up on that as well.
Hey, Brian. Thank you so much for the lecture, and thank you for sticking around a little late on a Friday with us. But yeah, I think this is all part of a similar conversation, and I'm wondering, you know, you mentioned that monitoring you expect to be done by engineers, and so I'm curious to hear you talk about how you think of the role of documentation in this type of work, or even its relevance. And, you know, it's so ephemeral, it's based in maintenance and process and time. It's a field condition often, like you were just saying. So, you know, what are you interested in documenting? Who is it for? And for to what end?
Well, I either misspoke or was unclear. So we are doing some of the monitoring. The idea was that we were going to be out there doing all of it. We're trying to, one of the things I want is for landscape architects to get a little bit better at collecting our own data, not to be scientists, but to be able to do the basics and then be able to work with our scientists in a little smarter way. Because of COVID-19, we've actually been working with a local NOAA affiliate who's partnered with the DEC up there. So he'll take his drone out according to our protocol, and then we analyze and process the data to see where sediments moved around and stuff like that. So, and what I was saying about the engineers is they can take that data and calibrate models, these computational models that are predictive of how sediment move around according to a certain wave environment. That's maybe actually 10 years from now, once y'all are professors and practitioners and stuff, y'all will actually be doing that. It's just beyond me. It's the physics and such is, I'll probably never get there. But, oh geez. So what, maybe I'm getting tired. What was the rest of your question? Or the point of your question, I'm sorry.
I guess, would you say that the primary goal of documentation for you is like knowledge production, I suppose, or is there an aesthetic role for documentation to play?
Oh, yeah, right. No, that's a great question. So beforehand, but like before the thing was built, we actually did a decent amount of documentation, not much of a standard CD set, but we did do some some AutoCAD line drawings that were essential for permitting, showing what should be built and according to what elevations and everything. All those were based on physical and computational models, as well as GIS analysis. So all the stuff you are learning was super relevant for what we had to produce. And we sort of took those and in the ways that you are already learning and made them into slightly less technical, slightly more accessible illustrations, essentially, so that interested community members or political people that are often not technical in that way could understand them. We will be doing something similar with the representations that we are collecting from the data analysis. Am I sharing my screen still? So this is the this is just a before and after. We've done one more flight run. We were supposed to have done about 12 to really monitor where the sediment's moving, but because of COVID, we've done 3 total. But we'll be producing a whole series of these and having discussions with the scientists that are a part of things like the DEC, so that they can help us understand what we're seeing, and so that we can sort of offer our sort of hypotheses. Like, we think it's doing this, and because we tilted the berm this way, maybe we saw that. We're also going to, that wave model that I showed you, we have that as a wave environment that's built out now. So we will actually model the storm that came in and made these movements and see if the computational model gives us something pretty close to what we actually saw. If we did, you know, that'd be super exciting, especially to the Army Corps, because they'd be like, oh, our tool is really close. But all of that is like big NSF funded stuff by like super smart people that we just contribute tiny little data sets to. Just like the astrophysicist who's like shooting lasers from a drone and characterizing waves just from a DJI Phantom, like that's way beyond what we can do. All we could do was ask the right question. Like, we need to know what those waves are doing in that moment, not when the NOAA had a buoy out there in 2017. And so he's like thinking, and then his team's working. And so I think often that's actually the role of design. Since we're mostly focused on effects and not causes, we can articulate clearly what desirable effects or characteristics are. And the scientists and engineers are much more sophisticated at helping figure out how to sort of, what might cause that, I guess. That makes sense. Or it's just some words.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I'm going to cut it off at 2 more questions, if that's all right with you. Gordon has a question and Chris has a question, and then we'll let you have an actual week Friday night.
Yeah.
Gordon.
Hi, Brian. I guess I was wondering a little bit about how the aesthetics of land and water in relation to the painting of Buenos Aires and the Michael Heiser piece. Like, I don't know if you know the way that Michael Heiser does his representation for double negative and some of his other land art. If any of that has informed how you've actually been doing drawings and how you've been representing your work, if those things tie in.
I don't know. Do you know? Can you tell me? I don't know. That's a great question, Gordon. Well, I'm definitely looking at those works and trying to learn something from them. Occasionally I can articulate it in a fairly clear way. But in terms of, honestly, in terms of drawing itself, especially style of representation, I've been, I think because of the landscapes I'm working in, one of the concepts that I'm finding is very important is much higher degree of precision than I'm used to, than I was trained for as a landscape architect working at Thomas Balsley Associates doing urban plazas. And there, screwing together things to make a seat bench or doing a nice footer for a concrete wall or something, that was really important. And I got to respect the materials and learn that. But the level of precision required, the level of math required to just approach like how sediment's moving around in this landscape, or what height the waves might be as they come onto the barrier bar, is, or or even just how to build that model using all of the different environmental data, and then collect the data ourselves with the drones, is way beyond the norm. And yet the look is quite ambiguous, at least to me. Like there's not a figure, or there might kind of be a figure for a time and then it dissipates, or you kind of have to squint to see it, kind of like a watercolor painting or something. And I think that's where I'm going stylistically, that like I'm going away, maybe the whole field, I don't know, is going away from the tendency of like the Illustrator diagram dominating everything, you know, produce it in Rhino and then Illustrator it up. That is actually super appropriate for certain types of things, but maybe here we work a lot, ambiguity, physical, formal, experiential ambiguity, I think is really important, but it's arrived at through tremendous amounts of precision, which is a kind of strange paradox in these landscapes that I'm trying to grapple with through aesthetics. I think it is one of the things that sort of attracts us to these places. And coincidentally, you know, that is, there is something fundamental about these very old ways of working that is becoming more relevant to my stuff. Like watercolor, excuse me, watercolor is very close to my sediment drawings, or mine and Sean's and Tessa's sediment drawings. Like that also is just very finely ground rocks, basically some kind of mineral, and water over a kind of bumpy medium that does something which you have some control over. And you can't control every single stroke, and yet somehow you create a totality that is affecting or alluring or something. Or in my case is weird and bad. But I think that about your question. I think it's a great question, and I haven't thought about it a lot, but those are my notes on it. I should say, I haven't had a lot of time in the last few years to think that much about drawing as a normal landscape architect, because I've been trying to do this work. And so in a lot of meetings with communities and regulators and engineers, and then I've been trying to learn the tools and work with concepts and values that matter to them, and yet can be grafted onto or built out from landscape architecture. And I find that it is ending up in a little bit of a weird place, or different place, you know. It's anyways, it is what it is.
So one last question, if you don't mind, from Chris, and then we'll let you we'll let you go.
Yeah, sorry, kind of sneaking in under the buzzer here, but I think it's a pretty short answer probably, because I'm just wondering what some of the actual conversations have been like when you're approaching community members and contractors with something that is so inherently unpredictable and has a lot of risk in it, especially because I think, you know, working with the materials and the representation style of coastal engineering, they maybe might be at times misled into thinking that you have like a very precise understanding of what's going to happen. And kind of maybe connecting to Colleen's question about documentation, do you have a responsibility to come back after and explain to them like, no, this is actually kind of more of an experiment than a precise Band-Aid?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so we make that point, or through these projects, this one, and then the other Port Futures projects, and then some in Baltimore, we make the case that, or make it clear that there's aspects of the project that are experimental from the very beginning, that we're asking questions. We have some idea using our methods, but we're at the limits of our knowledge. These are what those limits are. These are why we think this or that. But we need to monitor it, or we need to discuss it afterward or whatever, because we're going to learn things. And in this case, that's often appealing. And I think that ethos is actually something we are trying as a field, or not just as a field, as a society maybe, or aspects of our society, trying to encourage that, because it's a fact. Like, we need to learn a lot of things, and we don't know a lot, especially the experts. I don't think that that's that different actually from what I would call good design, or what I learned as good design. It's just an extreme version. Like, what I do is kind of an extreme version, because I'm a researcher and I get to like focus a lot on these types of things, and I don't have to do projects that pay the bills. Like, I'm at the university. But in my opinion, good design, like some of the early Hargraves projects in Guadalupe River Park, they would have been ensuring certain performances. There's certain aspects of the project that need to be, in as much as anything can be guaranteed, they need to be guaranteed. Like, you're gonna be able to play baseball here, and you can get safely here, and it will be accessible, and there's gonna be water, so that, whatever. And yet, there should also always be a bigger agenda, or a theory, or a question that you're asking that's a part of the design. And it can be explicit with the client, or it can be implicit, as long as it's not like nefarious or something. But so, for instance, if you're designing an urban plaza, you might, you're using some of the different compositional techniques and making sure people can connect and see the stores or whatever is happening, and they have places to sit or whatever they need. And yet you might have some theory that by like depressing the center, it's going to become this exhibition space where people from the surrounding neighborhood, as the neighborhood densifies, people are going to come here and perform in some way. And this is sort of an idea. We're always speculating in that way, and then it never actually happens exactly like that, right? Like, whatever y'all are designing in studio, or whatever the architectural rendering is, or landscape architectural rendering that in any project, it's never used just like that. It never looks just like that. The plants never grow just like that. There's always some portion that's beyond control, or it's experimental. And so I see this type of practice as just a kind of exaggerated version of that ethos that's in good design, and probably has been for as long as I could trace it back in the history of design. But that being said, with coastal things, so there's two sort of strategic or tactical things that I'll end with, because I think I was sort of evading your question in a little bit, or making a larger point, maybe. I'll say it, making a larger point instead of evading. I think, so we're talking about wetlands and the creation of habitat, which are inherently dynamic. So it's been done for a long time, where engineers would come in, put in rock dikes around some portion, or a scientist working with an ecologist and an engineer. They put in a rock dike, control it, put in a little sill structure where you have a little inflow, and you're pretty sure you're going to get a wetland of a certain type, because it's really controlled and very expensive. And that is not the game here. Like, it's too expensive to do at the scale that we need. And it's like somehow antithetical. I mean, it's useful in a certain way, it ensures a certain performance, but it's antithetical to what those places are and should be. And also, they're not a road or a wastewater treatment plant. Like, when you're building a wastewater treatment plant, it's not okay to be like, yeah, this is an experiment. Like, the sediment might fill in front and protect it from waves, or it might not. It's like, no, we want the rock wall. We want the concrete wall. But the problem of coastal design, in one way, as I see it, or in river design and landscape design, is engineers figured out all these awesome, like 100 years ago, figured out all these awesome concepts and techniques and conventions for designing bridges, roads and railroads, wastewater treatment plants, all these things we needed. And then we were like, well, we also need all these other things because we destroyed the wetlands. And they're like, oh, we have some methods for that. So they just like applied it there, but it's not appropriate, in my opinion. And yet we don't necessarily yet have an alternative, or we haven't figured out how to appropriately hybridize with what's really awesome about some of those old approaches. So it's my long answer. Sorry, Chris. I'm rambling now. I'm glad you're cutting it off, Brad. I have no ability to get to the point. So
no, we come on, we very much appreciate your time and all of your answers. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. We owe you a dinner and a drink at the least. Thank you, Brian. It's great. It's great to have your lecture. I mean, I'm beyond myself excited to have you on the faculty, and I think the students are as well. So yeah, it's great to have you here. Great to hear your voice. Great to have you spend an hour answering questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure, y'all. Good luck. I should say that I'm really excited to meet y'all in some form or fashion, and then in person soonish. But that also, I really admire y'all. I think y'all are intrepid. In general, I'm always excited, the folks that are going into landscape, and especially at UVA, is such an amazing tradition of all these incredible and dedicated folks. And then to do it and to make the decision, it's always a big life decision, and to do it now and in this compromised fashion, but recognizing that the work can't wait, and yet it's time to proceed. I'm really, I admire it. So yeah, see you around soon.
Thank you, Brian.